just reflects. I took one of those strength finder aptitude tests, and number one for me was context, which I think is really boring. But when I thought about it, I understood. I really like to understand why a person became the way she or he is. That's very important to me. So I think that's why even with my contemporaries, there's a bit of history. But yeah, and I've written a number of nonfiction books, and it was very important to me, especially with Japanese American history, because these people who were incarcerated in in the detention camps, they were still alive. So I wanted to interview them, and it was important for me to have their real names in the books. But, that generation has passed, for the most part. So I think now's the time I feel like as a mystery writer, I can step in. And there's so many things that are unanswered, like for Clark and Division, there was these unsolved crimes, and there's no one to say what really happened. So I thought, okay, this is my role now to step in and to imagine. So that's why I started writing these historicals.
And for me, though, even though my contemporary series, the Charlie Mack Motown Mysteries, seems contemporary, it's really set in the mid 2000s. So, I still have to do a lot of research around them, especially around technology and that kind of thing. But before that, I had written a self-published novel, a historical fiction set in World War II about Negro soldiers on stateside and their service, and it was a mystery as well. And I'm just now really fascinated in history, and I was not in college. I just kind of really hated it actually. But now I think almost all our answers come from an understanding. And we talk about context, Naomi, an understanding of where we've come in this country, where as communities and ethnic groups we've come. A lot of our current tensions can be traced back to historical tensions. Lots of parallels between this current time and previous times that we can learn from, I think. So I'm fascinated by history now.
Shelley, I wanted to find out from you as well. I mean, you have a trilogy that's also historical, and then your standalone book, which is historical, but it focuses both of those focus on the 30s and 40s in Northern California, and specifically women and gender issues. So tell me, why historical mysteries?
Yeah, I think there were some personal parts of my family's history that I've been chewing on all my life. I'm from Dust Bowl Okies, and they, had that whole Grapes of Wrath experience. And my dad even grew up in the same labor camp that was featured in Grapes of Wrath. So
Well,
I was always had an interest in what happened to them then that would explain where we are now and the wide variety of people in our families. How did we all get this way? So that was always kind of cooking for me. But additionally, I've also always had a preoccupation with older women. That, like, if I could identify an elder woman who had done some really amazing things, I would always find myself asking, how did she get there? How did she, if she were born in 1920, how did she get to here? And I would think about an example might be Supreme Court Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg as an example, to think of women who went to law school, graduated at the top of their class, and took jobs as legal secretaries because they couldn't get hired. So how did they get the rest of the way was always a preoccupation of mine. So it kind of turned into this ongoing theme of mine. If I could identify some woman with real chutzpah and power and authority and content now, what was it like for her in the 1930s, in the 40s, and the 50s, and so on? So I think that's what really pulled me into that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So let's go to a very basic question here. What's considered historical these days? And Cheryl, you alluded to that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Historical Novel Society, someone referenced that earlier. describes it as at least 50 years. So that would make it the 1970s, you know. But there are purists I know who who don't buy that definition. You know, and every year that chugs by, you know, pretty soon 2000 will be historical fiction. But you know, I think it can be, you know, I think I like the 50-year description. Maybe 70 is even better for me, just personally. But yeah,
You know, I think 1990s.
1990s, yeah.
And I think I was looking that up too. I think the historical writers, they have a short story contest, and it's like 35 years.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is I'm also considering our readers. And there are, you know, a lot of people who read historical fiction are older, but you know, if we want to kind of encourage younger readers to kind of come to us, we have to acknowledge that, you know, they might have been born just in the aughts, you
Yeah.
know. So the 1990s is kind of historical, and even if you're in your 40s, you might not remember too much of what happened in the 90s. So I keep that top of mind. And, you know, in this whole pandemic era that we've survived, you know, you could even argue something pre-pandemic might even be
Mhm.
considered historic in some ways.
Yeah. I'll say that the Historical Novel Society does say it's 50 years, but several publishers say 25 years.
Wow.
And then I mentioned to this group the other day that when I was at a panel discussion the other day, someone brought up that they think the hottest areas for historical fiction right now are 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so when you start to think about it, there is a question of like the chronological distance from that time. But I'm
Mhm.
thinking more and more it's about our cultural distance from the time. Like
Mhm.
you can, if you went back to 2000 or 1995, so much has changed just in terms of technology and the way we normally live that you would almost, like you were describing, Cheryl, you have to do research to get it right to make sure if in an emergency detective needed to reach somebody, what really would they have done? You know, so I think too, it's like this sense of a cultural distance from the time we're in. And also, my feeling is like if you actually have to do research to bring up that time, it's not enough just to call from your memory. That feels like historical fiction to me, too.
Mhm.
These days, we still, even if it happened 2 years ago, we might have to do research just to remember,
That's true.
right? Things are
Especially with
changing so
technology.
quickly.
They are.
Yeah.
Well, and
Uh,
because we also do crime, right? So it's also
yeah.
think about how are what about forensics?
Yeah. I think popular culture also can drive it, and so it might be around a trend. I think I mentioned in our previous call, we had a pre-call, the Gilded Age and the fascination people have across generations with the Gilded Age because they were smart. They smartly put some young people in there. And so there's lots of interest right now in that turn of the century time and what society was like. I think Downton Abbey brought a lot of people to that era as well. Maybe not so much for young people, to your point, Naomi, but younger than me.
Well,
Yeah.
you know, I think the whole African American storyline in the Gilded Age, I
Yeah.
think
Yes,
that's because
fascinating, isn't
that
it?
series was not that popular the first season,
Correct. That's
and then
right.
it shot up. And I do think it's the examination of like the Black elite in Newport, which
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
really fresh and a
Yeah,
different take of what
and a
we.
very little told story.
Exactly.
Right.
I would also say in the Downton Abbey example, one of my favorite kind of details in there was like when they brought electricity into the house and when they
Yes.
brought phone lines into the house, like the dowager just freaking out. It was disgusting. It was like uncouth and all of that. It is kind of fun when you get to be surrounded by details that you take for granted and assume are normal. And in
Yeah.
another time, they're very different.
And then think of Hamilton and how many young people had not even considered the Constitutional Congress, but somehow gotten pulled to that narrative because of Hamilton.
Yeah.
I know we're going to talk about research, but sometimes things you could discover, like when I did research for my 1903 book, they had electric cars in Pasadena. you know, and we just think, oh, this is such, you know, it's such a
Yeah.
new concept. Only a genius could think this up. But it's actually the concept has been around for a very long time. So that's the other side of it. There's things that could have happened that we don't connect to the past.
Well, so let's get into the research part. I was wondering if you could talk to us about the research you do for your books and kind of your process, how you blend the writing and the research, and how much time you spend on research.
Well, I'll start by saying gobs of time, just gobs and gobs. And it depends on the project. For times I'm doing probably a year's worth of research, but I was writing at the same time. For the older story, for the historic story set in 1929, I definitely did 2 or 3 months of research on that, kind of standalone research, because I wanted to write it organically. So I kind of immersed myself in that time period. Um, when I did when I did the World War II story, I was prompted by Ken Burns' piece on the war, his documentary series on the war. I was fascinated by it, but I also didn't think it jibed with the stories I had heard from my father about his experience in World War II. And so that took me down the rabbit hole of researching the Negro experience during World War II. So I think it depends on the project, and you kind of really never stop researching. I don't know about you, Naomi or Shelley, but even after the project's over, once you get fascinated by a period, you kind of stay with it.
That's why I have a trilogy.
Good job.
I would say about the research part, my first book, Copy Boy, gosh, I'm embarrassed. I feel like I was researching that my whole life because so much of it was centered on family experience. So I was always immersed in family stories about that time, living in a labor camp and picking cotton before school and after school and all that. But also, through adulthood, I had been reading about Dorothea Lange, the Works Progress Administration photographer, and John Steinbeck, and all kinds of thinkers in that place, just because I was eager to see my family treated with some kind of dignity or wholeness, like not as a stock figure. So I used to read about it all the time. And then I started writing. And so then it felt like I had a life's worth of research all surrounding me on my desk because I've just been obsessed with it before. But that is very different than now. So that my fourth book right now was a lot more targeted. It was a lot more methodical, and it involved reading the first couple of paragraphs in a history of San Francisco and finding a, to me, very shocking account of something that had happened. And then it left that topic almost immediately. And I couldn't understand why. And when I started doing research, I found that there were real holes in the record because people had been tamping down those events. And so there was a lot of time spent trying to gather information and get people's help to find out what really happened. And then it turned into the kind of deal where that door is not opening. Those documents, the grand jury reports I sought, were missing. And
Mm,
so it became kind of an invitation to invent in that absent space. But I really had to do a lot of gathering, and I spent a lot of time on the phone with librarians all over the Bay Area who've always been so helpful to me. I'll say one more thing about research is that I'm not a journalist. Two of you are journalists. I'm not a journalist, though I love them and write about them. So I'm a little afraid to reach out to experts. I'm insecure when I make that phone call or that email. I think they're going to say, who are you to do that? And so I just had to kind of grow up and do it anyway. And I cannot believe how helpful people are when you do reach out.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, Shelley. I was just talking to I interviewed the writer of this, remember the Coroner to the Stars, Thomas Noguchi? He's
Yeah.
still alive. And
Wow.
his biographer, she's an academician, but she had to become a journalist and be on the phone, like you said, and it was only her persistence where she got information. I think for me, I may first go, I mean, maybe it's the journalist for me. I do look at newspapers.com a
Yeah.
lot in the very beginning. But that's just uh, a report about a certain incident. And again, I need to know the larger story. So from there, I usually pick up, and I'll tell everyone in the audience who's thinking of writing historicals, you're really lucky because there's so many things that are digitized now. There's so
Yes.
many resources, so many, and I am so just pleased with the Los Angeles Public Library. I know Sacramento, you must have all the, government records and all that, but I would recommend if you ever come to Los Angeles, get a LA Public Library card. It's open to anybody in California. I have people out of state. You have to pay $50, but it kind of opens a door to so many different kinds of resources. And it's wonderful because this is kind of bad because we don't need to leave our homes, but it's all there for us. So I think, and there's websites for oral histories. There's all these wonderful information that's out there that's available through the internet. Um, and I do think relationships, just like Shelley was saying, to build relationships with librarians, don't forget about them, acknowledge them in your book, write thank you letters. And the same goes with professors. And you may be kind of reluctant to like contact the writer of this book that you really love, but do you know how many people contact them about their book? Not many. So they kind of, and then you could foster that relationship. And if you're doing a series, you could follow up with them later. So those kind of, and they love to know that their work is kind of being integrated into something like a mystery where people are killed and there's a crime to solve. So, yeah.
Do you
So,
guys
so
do
I
a
would,
lot of interviews? Oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you guys interview a lot of people.
I did. I mean, and then when you talk about techniques of historical research, interviews, newspapers.com was invaluable to me for Times Undoing. Naomi's right, they're digitizing more and more of these newspapers. And so, we really have a leg up over people who were writing historical fiction even 10 years ago.
Mm.
I was able to get my hands on Black newspapers from the 1930s and 1920s, and it really helps you to get a sense of the culture and the language, and looking at want ads tells you what people are interested in, death notices. I mean, it really gives you an opportunity to acclimate yourself to a period, and I found that invaluable. The one-on-one interviews were helpful, maybe not as original source material, but follow up for things I found in original source material. Historical societies are great, not so great for Black and African American stories. I don't know how they are for Japanese American stories, but they are a good resource for folks who are doing research around a particular area or community or city, or state even. The other things I found were ancestry.com is useful for getting your hands on census materials, street directories, shipping, transport records. I mean, you could really go down an Alice in Wonderland hole, in ancestry.com.
I feel like with my previous book called Poster Girl, set like kind of in the Rosie the Riveter time,
Yeah.
one thing that made it so lovely for me was I live relatively close to the Richmond shipyards where my novel was set. And they have the Rosie the Riveter Museum in the trust, and they gather the Rosies. The remaining Rosies are always welcome there, and they're always available for people to talk to. You can go to one of their events, talk to them. They have all of these oral histories. Like working on that project, it was such a trove of actual women's voices doing this work because they found this group, or this group found them and is shepherding their voices. However, my current book involves women who were raped in the 1945 VJ Day peace riot in San Francisco that almost no one's heard about. There were at least 6 women raped, and they know there were more. And they don't have a single name. No one was ever prosecuted. No one was ever investigated. It was just lying there underneath. And that created trouble for me research-wise, because I felt like, how can I try to describe the voices of these people when I've not heard their voices? I haven't heard their version of what it was like to pass through that time. And it was really limiting to me. And then I found a source that helped a lot. Like, I'd done so much research into the sound of women's voices then, but not rape victims then. I couldn't find anything. Then I found a book called The Trauma Beat. And I can't remember the author's name, I'm embarrassed to say, but it was someone who wrote about more contemporary trauma victims, crime victims, who were then being interviewed by journalists. And that's like a key part of my book, so that even though the voices in that book were not from 1945, there were women who'd gone through a traumatic experience and then experienced the trauma of the press on top of that. And I wound up thinking, this isn't historically accurate, but it's universally accurate. It's authentic about human reactions to crisis. So, sometimes I just find I have to work with what I've got. It's frustrating when you can't find exactly what you want, but you find a way to work with what you've got.
Yeah, Shelley, I totally agree with you. And I have integrated interviews now as part of my process. And just because there's some universal things that people go through, or there's relationship things that it doesn't matter. Like there's an issue of abortion in Clark Division, and I actually interviewed, this was during the pandemic, a young, she's, probably in her 40s, but she was Japanese American and had an abortion, and just like shame issues, those kind of cultural issues she shared with me. So yeah, I think I do a lot of interviews now. I went on I'm doing 1950, my next book after this 1903 one is 1959. So there's people there. So 80-year-old man, who was in a gang, it's kind of a gang book. He drove me to the hood where he lived, and it was so I mean, there's little nuggets of information that is not going to be even in, and this is not a population that was really interviewed. They don't have necessarily aspirational stories. So I would, yeah, recommend that, don't be scared. And it doesn't matter if the interview doesn't go perfectly, but anything you get is better than getting nothing. So yeah, I would recommend that everyone, even if you're not doing historicals, to kind of yeah, be a journalist for a day and see what it feels like.
Can I mention one other resource here in DC that is also a resource to every American, and that's the Library of Congress. They have repositories of letters, which is another really wonderful source of information. And in fact, you may find letters, Shelley, from the 30s from San Francisco. I mean, there's I don't know how much of it is digitized now. You might have to make a trip here to get a pass to go in and plumb the bowels of the LOC, but it's a wonderful resource. And they have some audio files as well, so you can hear voices, which is, to your point, really invaluable. The other thing is there's a group called StoryCorps that's been funded by public broadcasting for about 30 years, and they have a repository of audio files of folks talking about all kinds of things. You can do a keyword search and see if there's something there for you.
And if you're in the mood to cry, you could just log on to StoryCorps and do that.
Yes,
True.
lots of poignant stories.
Um, I do something. I know some people hold what they're working on very close to their vest and they don't want it revealed. But I kind of blurted out early on, and I use Facebook. My Facebook author page is, I've kind of stayed with it. I know a lot of people dropped it, but I get a lot of engagement from there, and I just tell people I'm looking into this subject. And luckily, I guess a lot of people who follow me kind of may have the information, and that's been given me has given me so many wonderful leads. And I'll find someone who's related, whose great grandfather had lived in that particular area. This is like for a nonfiction book. And yeah, so I think in a weird way, social media can be a help too in finding sources.
You guys have any sort of unusual tips and techniques to get some of those really kind of minute details? I notice you all, in all of your books, you all have something in there that's really, it seems really minor, but it's the kind of thing that really lends authenticity. And I know, Naomi, that you sometimes go on eBay.
I
So that's what
love
I mean by
eBay.
it.
I'm not a shopper, but I spent a lot of time there. And just like I found clues, like there's a certain kind of clue to one of my mysteries, and I actually got those certain kind of tickets. I ordered them from eBay. But again, I'm dealing with that uh, for those books, they were 1940s spaced. So you're going to, you're not going to find something from the 5th century or whatever. But, if you're dealing with more recent, like American history, there you could find some. And I love postcards. I'm always buying
Mhm.
postcards because old photos are black and white, and these postcards, someone colored them, and it's kind of nice to see them in that, yeah, that way.
Mhm.
I want to show you something I kept because I wanted to give them, oh, it's backwards, at least how I can see it. But this is San Francisco in the 1930s, the WPA Guide to the City by the Bay. And I only want to bring it out is because it was a project of the WPA, like to put writers to work. And a lot of the writers that assembled this information were fantastic writers. And the style of this thing, it makes it really readable. But it is like a treasure trove for people who are writing about Northern California in the 30s and 40s. Like with my first book, every bar, every diner, every bus line, every telephone number I got from this book because it was so detailed. And one of my best experiences with a book club ever was I found a bar that I just in this book that I loved so much, and I had to put a big scene in it, and I did. And then I went to a book club, and a woman said, my grandfather was the bartender at that bar, and he was there when that happened. So it was like, this is not something that makes your book necessarily better, but it makes my life better as an author to feel like I landed on something that was authentic and real and experienced. And it just kind of makes it's like bubbles in champagne. It just brings a little something extra to the story.
Mhm. I guess I would also recommend when you can oral histories. I mean, it's similar to letters, I guess. So for the World War II book, I was able to thankfully get a few people who had served, African American men and women who had served in World War II, and they were really happy to talk about their stories and their service and the pride they had, and they show their little mementos and the artifacts they had, and it was really helpful for language, and sometimes even sentences that I would put in the book. For Times Undoing, similarly, that since that's based on a family story, I did a series of oral histories with my mom, who was 96 at the time, and I recorded them. And it's funny when you're doing it as an interview as opposed to just talking to your mother about your family, it really engaged her in a different way, and she remembered some things that she hadn't remembered before. And so I did a series of those telephone oral histories with mom, and they were really helpful too.
How wonderful, Cheryl, that you have
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, thank
Now
you.
you could use Zoom. If
No, yeah, I
Yeah,
don't
if
think
the
she'll.
person could use, yeah.
I don't think she'll get on Zoom.
Oh, okay, yeah, some people, yes. Zoom is still a challenge, but yeah.
And so when it comes to the actual writing part, I mean, there's just so much world building you have to do with historical fiction. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you balance, the historical factual information with your story and the characters and plot.
That's the key, right?
Yeah. And I think it depends on depends on the project too. I don't know for you and Shelley and Naomi, but with the World War II book, I wanted to do such honor to the period and to the people, that I, found myself just kind of crazy focused on the research. So I would get every little detail right. So I remember spending a day and a half researching jukeboxes, and then another day writing about the damn jukebox, which was only like a half a page in the story, but I wanted to get it right. So you do get a little fixated, I think, about it. For Times Undoing, it was a tough balance of telling the story and getting the history right, and then imagining the part of the history that you don't know.
Mhm.
And that was a more of an emotional roller coaster than I had imagined.
I do have to say it is easier if you have the crime, if you have like maybe you know of a certain crime that was committed, but
Hmm.
there's maybe justice never prevailed, or there's a lot of details that you're unaware of.
Hmm.
Um, because we're mystery writers, right? We're
Yeah,
crime writers, and
it's
we
a
have the
challenge.
thing that propels us.
Hmm.
We know of the inciting incident. So I think with new okay, with Clark and Division, I had this community report that had said that there had been a sex maniac who had attacked, like 5 or 6 Japanese American women during that time. So that was the thing that would propel the story. So and I think when it's harder when you just want to reflect a certain time period and maybe you don't have the crime
Okay.
and you have to figure out how am I going to insert a crime, but then it's like Back to the Future. You don't want to just make up something that might change in the future either. So it's very tricky with Crown City. This was an investigation of my hometown of Pasadena, and a lot of things, kind of the mysteries, like why Pasadena, why all this Japanese aesthetic, why, it's more looking at the erasure of things, but there wasn't necessarily a huge crime that had happened in relation to that. So so I'm a bit nervous. This book is coming out in February because it's kind of mystery light, I'll be honest. I don't have a serial killer, through there. So but it was so important. I have like 12 to 13 real people in there.
Okay.
So
Oh,
this was a disaster in terms of research because not only the time and place, I was looking at the lives of these 13 people, and I don't want to be disrespectful. They're more, some are important, but I didn't want to totally manufacture things that completely didn't happen. So, it's tricky. I don't know, Shelley, with your mysteries, how it works.
I'll say one thing about one of, and on a more superficial side of it, I'll say that in my book Tomboy, I needed to get my protagonist, Jane, from San Francisco to New York so she could stow away on the Queen Mary to see Wimbledon. And so I had no idea how to get her there. So I called the librarian at the California State Railroad Museum. And he put a couple of volunteers on it. And 2 weeks later, they gave me 19 single space typed pages of a document called Let's Get Jane to New York. And it was like every potential train line she could take, how much all the tickets cost, which would she be more likely to take having no money, how much is this ham sandwich, what is the upholstery like, who were the Pullman, all that stuff. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it. And then I just shoved as much of it in there as I could because it was fantastic, such a gift. And I gave it to my editor and she goes, "Oh my God, I love this. I love those volunteers. They're amazing. I love that museum. You know, you have to cut it, right?" Because the whole story
Oh
stopped
no.
into the upholstery on train seats and the quality of the ham sandwich. You know what I mean? So it's like, but I needed all that that mountain of information to get to the bits that wind up
Mhm.
being useful and revelatory in the story itself,
Mhm.
which is what Naomi, I really appreciated that you started by saying you're thinking about the crime, you're thinking about the characters, you're thinking about the through line, and you make sure not to lose that with research info dumps, which is totally what I do in a first draft. So many unnecessary pages of information I turned up and left, but it doesn't serve the story. And my worldview, we have to serve the story and the characters, and the history makes it more authentic. But there's a lot of different views on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm leaning toward making sure the historical nuggets are accurate and emotional to invoke curiosity out of the reader at this point. I mean, yeah, you always want to get your characters right and your plot. I'm a plotter, so you want to get that right too. And now I'm just trying to figure out how to use this nuggets of historical fact and build curiosity in the reader to want to know more. So my current project is 1870s Kansas. Um, I had been describing it as a Western, but I thought maybe that might be too limiting. Maybe I describe it as historical fiction, 1870s Kansas. And by virtue of being in 1870s rural Kansas, it is a Western. But I wanted to tell the story of Black cowboys, but not in a limited way. It's a Black Pinkerton. I wanted to tell the story of the America's pitting of its peoples of color against each other, the Native Americans against Mexicans, but Blacks against Native Americans, and Native Americans who held slaves. I mean, it's so intricate, and I wanted just to, give a little tip of the iceberg about how that was a tension at play during Reconstruction. Shelley, your background in Oklahoma is fascinating to me. It has been since I read Grapes of Wrath. And I started off with this Western really studying whether my location should be Oklahoma because it is amazing as a place to look at in that time period with the influence of the railroads, with the Indian wars that were going on, with the the demilitarization of America after the Civil War. It's just a fascinating time and a fascinating space in the middle of America.
I also noticed what you were saying, Cheryl, reminded me of what Naomi said about being driven to understand context. I
Mm.
don't know a lot of historical fiction writers who aren't fascinated by the connections between things. Like, what were all the things? What was happening in baseball at this point?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
was happening in economics? What was happening politically? What was happening in fashion? I don't know really any historical fiction writers who just aren't fascinated by all those connections. And they don't get to all go in there, but I feel like sometimes they're like this subterranean kind of musculature. Like the
Mhm,
reader might
mhm.
feel them in there where an
Absolutely.
outfit crops up and they're like, yeah, I'm wondering about the fashion right then.
Right. Right. And that's why newspapers are such a great resource for that kind of thing, because you got your sports section, your comics, your want ads, your political news at the front, your society news, sometimes depending on how big the newspaper is, it really can give you a snapshot of time and place.
I do think you do have to center it on your main characters. Like, what are they looking at? Do they care? Like, I'm writing about the early 1900s, but my main character is an 18-year-old carpenter from Yokohama.
Mm.
He's not going to be as fascinated by what the women are wearing, but he's going to be looking at what the different kinds of wood.
Yeah.
He goes bowling or 10 pin, they had that, but the bowling ball's made out of wood. So those are kind of things that he's going to notice. So I think that could kind of help us not to do the info dump. It's like through, even if you do even if you're doing third, but a close third, it's like, what is your character going to notice? So that could help trim some of, maybe that character doesn't care about the upholstery. So you don't need to put that in. But if they're, upholsterer, they're going to notice, and maybe something spills on it and they know how to clean it. I don't know. So it's,
Mhm.
I think again, it goes back to character.
Mhm.
I also like what you said right there. If they're in a poster, they're going to notice the stain, and that's
Yeah.
something's going to happen in that scene. The other thing about research I really love when I read other people's books, I love to see what different jobs look like at different times in history,
Yeah.
especially when I don't know anything about that job. Like it was really fun for me to investigate welders for my last book because
Yeah.
I know nothing about welding. And it was like opened up a whole world of how to see the world if you're someone who holds this flame and turns one hard thing into liquid and it turns into, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's another area to look at. Like, what is the influence of work on the way this person behaves?
Yeah. Yeah. In Times Undoing, my main character, my grandfather, it was a carpenter. And so I learned a whole lot more about wood than I ever thought I'd be interested in.
Uh,
And the tools and the what was available at the time and what wood is good and what wood is more expensive and that kind of thing.
and back to Cheryl, are you planning to go to Kansas?
I've been to Kansas. I don't know if I'm going to go back now. I probably go to Oklahoma to the Cowboy Museum. Haven't been there yet. I started off writing this Western with a storyline that had a Native Americans in it, and then I felt like this kind of interesting to talk about in terms of doing historical fiction. I didn't know if I should write that story without a co-writer who was indigenous. And so I literally had written most of the story, and then I went back and took all that out just because I felt like I didn't want to do harm to anyone or get it wrong or be inauthentic or, because there's so many tribes and so many different traditions related to tribes and, who am I to do that? So,
Would you have like an expert maybe read it over?
yeah, I had a couple experts, but then even then I felt like, I would probably feel better if I could write it with, Ramona Emerson or Marcy Rendon or someone like that to really feel like I'm not stepping in doo-doo.
Mhm. And some historical novelists have done that. I think the personal librarian, the author,
Yes.
she co-wrote it with somebody, so
Yeah.
that it has been an option for some people.
Yeah.
Well, I was curious about how you each handle dialogue for historical mysteries, because people speak so differently, different time periods, even different generations speak differently. So I was wondering how you guys tackled that part.
I can say that in my first novel, Copy Boy, I had spent so much time while writing, kind of thinking of my grannies and my grandpas and my aunts and my uncles and my cousins and how they spoke. These, my dad was one of 10 kids. And so we would get together and it would be a room full of these people telling tall tales with very thick accents and really awesome, idiosyncratic ways of saying things. So I was constantly shoving all of that in my draft. And then I realized it was like impossible to read. It was so densely, it was like sometimes if you go back to read Huckleberry Finn, which stops us in multiple ways, but
Yeah.
one of the ways is the dialect can feel really dense,
Yeah.
and I had a couple of beta readers who said it's too much. And so that's when I started to develop this philosophy of like hand select the examples that I really want in places where it helps or matters and comb out, let the language be a little more universal elsewhere and not be overwrought. And I did know I didn't want ever to sound precious. I didn't want to write historical fiction that sounded too self-conscious. I
Mm.
wanted it to have almost like a veneer of now with things painted in that remind you, no, this is somewhere else and this is at another time. So I guess what I'm saying is for me, at least the first time, I had to dump it all in and then I had to comb it all out because it was impossible. Even if I tried reading it aloud, it was impossible.
Mhm. Uh,
I think
but-
to read the novels of the time, like
Mhm.
people of like the 1940s, writing about their contemporary, like Dorothy B. Hughes. I mean, a lot of times when you read some of these books, it's like, oh, this is very like plain, understandable English. I've done improv before. And it's like with improv, you know, you're depending on all these stereotypes of how,
Right.
you know, people spoke in different eras. And it really, you know, really wasn't like that. So I think that that can be super helpful. But I know what you're saying, Shelley. I've in my books that were not necessarily historical, I have integrated a lot of dialect, and that's probably one of the most controversial issues of my
Mhm.
work. And I've had to calibrate it, you know, and a lot of times you're not quite sure if it's going to land or not. You just kind of have to put it out there.
Mhm.
But, on one of my books, like, some people really hate a certain book because I have used so much dialect, but then other people love it, you know? And so you can't make everyone happy, so you have to kind of consider, "What am I trying to do with this particular
Mhm.
work?"
Mhm. Mhm.
And just put it out. You can't make everyone happy, you know?
Right, that's
So
true. Yeah,
so
I tend to think about it depends on what what your characters, what class setting they're in, on the language they might use. If I'm talking about a particular era, I am really reluctant not to use the words that might be a racial slur and to kind of sugarcoat it
Oh,
because I want some authenticity there. I've written a couple of books where hate groups are at center. Well, Charlie Mack has one, and then the Times Undoing has one. And, I don't want my racist protagonist saying, "Oh, look at that African American woman coming this way." I mean, and I will not beat the slur over the head,
Hmm.
but I think it has to be there, even if it's a trigger for people. And people have said to me, "That's a trigger for me," and I'm going like, I am not going to put good words in the mouths of
yeah.
hate groups. You know,
Right.
let me
uh,
ask you this, Cheryl, though.
yeah.
Is it easier for you to use racial epithets directed towards Blacks than other minorities?
I feel bad when I have to do it, but I have done it. No, I mean, I know I get your point, and I've called people and go like, "I'm going to say this. Is it okay to say it?" You know. Yes, it is harder. It is harder,
Mhm,
but I have done it, and I've even done it around using, writing about trans people and how the language around trans people has changed, or LGBTQ people have changed over
mhm.
what you can say and what you can't say. I think
That's
we have to
right.
be authentic to the times when we're writing historical novels.
That's right. I one win that I felt on that, I've got a character who cross dresses, and I was able to find like this little trove of accurate insults against such people that don't have any triggery things to us because they're so
Huh.
bizarre and stupid. But
Hmm.
I feel like I have a failure in my most recent book where
Yeah. Okay.
And
Yep.
my approach is different. It's, combed through. And the whole time I was writing it is a very short, I mean, there were a series of short chapters that led up to the actual rape. This is a very short chapter. And originally in my draft forever, the very last word in that chapter was the C word, what the
Hmm.
rapist said to the victim in 1945. It was
Hmm.
all the whole time I wrote it. And
Hmm.
y'all, I cut it before I turned it in.
Did you?
And that I feel that I regret that because I felt like the C word in that end of that sentence was the rape. You know, what I mean, it stood in for the description of
Mhm,
the rape.
mhm.
I
Hmm.
think I made the wrong call.
Hmm.
Also, I made the call that I was comfortable with at that moment because it's still
Hmm.
my consciousness as a writer, and I realize how triggered I am by that word. So I was extra sensitive to it. So it's not like I'm recommending anybody do what I did. I'm just telling you
Hmm.
what I did.
Hmm.
Yeah. But
Interesting.
that's a real life situation. I mean, words hurt. They
Yeah,
do
they can hurt.
hurt. And maybe if you're feeling uncomfortable with something, maybe you put it aside,
Yeah.
and kind of think about, maybe talk to other writers,
Yeah.
how did you deal
Yeah.
with this? This is good for discussion to kind of parse it out
Yeah.
rather than just doing a totally emotional response to it. But I know in this 1950s project I'm going to be working on, it's going to be from the viewpoint of two men. And that's really different than how women talk, you know?
Right, right.
And it was a very racist time. So, you know, but I feel okay to use like the J word, you know, with directed towards like a Japanese American protagonist. But
Mm-hmm.
the N word, you know,
You know,
it's harder, Cheryl.
it
It's
is
harder.
harder. You know, and I'm thinking as you're saying it, the way I've gotten around it in the Charlie Mack books is Charlie has a partner who's this, Archie Bunker guy who can say those things. I never put them in Charlie's mouth, but I will put them in his mouth.
Yeah.
Words, you know.
But in general, I think if we're kind of wrestling with issues of like either gender or race, or I think it's like, okay, let's do a little bit of a deep dive. Like, what was the situation with those people in that particular time period, you know?
Sure.
Because
Hmm.
with the Crown City book, I have stuff, Jennifer would appreciate this, you know, Japanese versus Chinese,
Yeah.
Mm,
you
yeah.
know, and there's a lot of history, you know, Japan
Yeah.
was at war with China. There's all
Yeah.
this stuff.
Yeah. All
But
that's
you know, so one of my characters who I'm kind of lauding, you know, was very anti-Chinese. So it's like, and it's a real person. So
yeah.
what do I do? Do I gloss over that?
Yeah.
You know, and it's like I can't, you know, but it forced me to do a deeper dive, and I figured out a way to present how he was towards Chinese people, but
Hmm.
also not paint him totally like total evil, you know. I
Hmm.
mean, luckily he's not one of my main characters, but he's a pretty important character.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
just, yeah,
Yeah,
that's what's hard about this historical
it's a balancing act,
writing.
yeah. And especially now when there is erasure going on, where words are being dismissed or
Yeah.
changed or deleted, I really feel like we need to protect words and the context of words and the history of words. When history is being erased, who are the folks who will hold it up so it still has light and sun around it, you know?
Exactly.
The J word, because my newest novel is set on VJ Day,
Mhm.
and the crowds that turned into a riot in San Francisco. I mean, and it's set in a journalism world. The
Mm.
headlines of the newspaper,
Mhm.
Japs
Yep.
Mhm.
surrender.
Sure.
Those were the headlines, you know?
Mhm.
Right in the headlines, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really big.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
big.
You know, and so I really fought with that a little bit, but also said, but I'm writing about how journalism then could be radically offensive and diminishing to all kinds of people. You know what I mean? So the headline is actually describing it as it was is actually in service to a better message that this is offensive and the reader might be offended.
Mhm.
But I struggle with it. I do. And I'll tell you one time when like one of my first semesters as a teacher, I taught for 34 years, college composition and adjunct. And one of my first semesters, I'd assigned all the King's Men, Robert Penn Warren's book set in the South, focused on Huey Long. And the first day I came in, I was very naive as a new teacher. And three young women stood up in the middle of my class and said, we did not fight our way to college to
Mm,
immediately be assigned a book that has the N word in it. And
mm,
it was like, oh my God, I thought that what he did in that book was in service of showing that was despicable. But
mhm.
that is not how my students felt
No.
about it.
Mhm.
Three students walked out and never came back.
No.
Maybe one of the more meaningful lessons I've ever had as a teacher. And I feel like that lesson comes to me or along with me as a writer, and so I am sensitive and sometimes maybe too sensitive. Like I shy away from using the C word because I don't
Mhm.
want to create trouble for a reader. So it's
Mhm.
it's a it's a balancing act. And you
Uh,
have to feel comfortable with your choices as the writer too. You have to
mhm.
be able to live with your choices.
I mean, it's our names that are on the books. So
Right. I have just an open-ended question. Do you think our male mystery crime fiction writers have that same problem?
no,
Just wondering, you know.
no, I don't think so.
Do they ruminate over?
No, I don't think so. And well, maybe more for are there going to be consequences, or if a
Mhm.
gatekeeper is going to reject
Mhm.
their work,
Yeah.
or, you know,
We
the
got
board
we got a yeah, we got a
want that.
gatekeeper's question from someone about what do editors do? Sometimes you have to fight for your words with the editors because again, they're really thinking about readership. And you have to say, and I think I had to say to an editor, I'm not going to have this guy who's the head of a hate group not use the N word. I'm not going to have him use it 17 times, but he's certainly going to use it this one time because that's the word he would use.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to give us some time for readers to ask their questions. But first of all, I wanted also for you to tell us a little bit about what's coming up for you next, or what you're working on now. Why don't you start, Shelley?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of my current book launches on Tuesday, so I'm not saying that I'm thinking real clearly on what's. I do have something that I think of it as this stage of research where it's just like there's a pot on the stove. It's not yet hot. I put a little oil. I'm piling up some vegetables, and I don't know what's going to happen yet. But the two things I'm thinking of are I'm thinking of letting my current protagonist, Sandy Zimmer, have a trilogy like my previous one did. And this time I would do it a little differently. I would let Sandy, this is set in 1945. She's the new publisher of a newspaper, which she inherits because her husband, the publisher, dies. So she's like 32 at this time. I'm thinking of her trilogy jumping up in 10-year increments so I can get to watch Sandy age. Since that was one of my original intents, I was really interested in very interesting, authoritative women who wind up fantastic as they're old. So I wanted to let Sandy age a little bit. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about. And I don't know to what degree it'll mesh with the other thing that's totally captured my attention is thinking of Naomi, thinking about your book, set in 1944, I think. Well, I'm very interested in researching Earl Warren.
Mm,
Because I'm from Bakersfield, where Earl Warren was raised.
mm,
Mm,
And I live in Sacramento, where he was governor. And
mm,
I've read so much about the Supreme Court that he,
mm.
was given charge of.
mm,
And one of the fascinating things to me about that is where I grew up in Bakersfield, nobody talks about Earl Warren. He's like such a famous person who was raised in town and went to Bakersfield High School. And well, that's because many people in Bakersfield hate his Supreme Court. He did all kinds of liberal things on the Supreme Court.
mhm,
Where I live now in Sacramento, there is almost nothing with Earl Warren's name on it. In Sacramento, there's obviously great resentment of his spearheading Japanese internment. And so I'm interested in the role of his decisions in favor of Japanese internment, whether there's some kind of thread that leads to a surprisingly different kind of Supreme Court.
mm,
I don't know what book that turns into. That's
mm.
what's interesting me right now. And so that's what I'm investigating. We'll see what happens.
That's
Shelley, would you
interesting.
ever do nonfiction?
I just haven't done it. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah,
That would be a fascinating book.
it would be. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Cheryl, what are you doing next?
So I am
People,
working, yeah, I'm working on the 1870 piece. It's I think it's a two-parter. And it's a black Pinkerton detective working with a black Secret Service agent, and there were those folks in history. And in 1870s post-Reconstruction, and they're investigating what starts off to be just a bank robbery, but turns into be something bigger that has more national implications, and the challenges they have as black law enforcement folks to even get the attention of Washington during that time, or the Texas Rangers who around that time. So it's a fun piece. And the second piece will be around 1871, I think, 1872, set in South Carolina, where these same two protagonists are infiltrating the Klan because that was an age when there were anti-Ku Klux Klan acts enacted by President Grant. So interested in that period. And then I'm working on a seventh Charlie Mack. And because it was set in the mid 2000s, I've moved this one up to right around, it's 2011. So I finally got to 2011, post-Obama, but still pre marriage equality. And so I'm trying to figure out how to get my two girls married somewhere.
Well, it seems a lot of people have questions, so I just want to briefly say, so the new book that I pitched, it hasn't been accepted, but see, I'm talking about it. I shouldn't be talking about things, but it's 1959, and one of the characters from Clark and Division, but another one is based on a real life, the first Japanese American LAPD cop.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a hard one because in the future, he is involved with like the Black Muslim shooting of Ron,
Yeah.
there's like heavy stuff. And
Yeah.
even though this isn't part of my story, I have to go down the rabbit hole to understand who this person is.
Right.
So
Wow, that's
this is what we do.
fascinating.
People, do you really want to do this?
Well, thank you so much. I think this was a really fascinating discussion. You gave us a lot of insights into how you write your historical mysteries and the research that you do. So thank you. I really, really appreciate it. You guys were
Thank you,
fantastic.
Jennifer.
So Rick, why don't we go ahead and have some people ask questions?
Okay, I've got the first question I have here. I'm going to try to condense these a little bit because I don't know if we're going to get through them all, but my story takes place during World War I. I need ideas where to look since there isn't as much out as in World War II. Any ideas on sites to research this type of info? World War I specifically.
Library of Congress, there's lots out on World War I at the Library of Congress, actually. And newspapers at the time. Actually, lots lots of information on World War I. Yeah, I ran across it and just looking at my 1920 stuff.
I also feel like when I usually like to do a lot of research before I meet someone and ask them questions because I don't want to waste their time. But there have been times when I couldn't get information in advance, and so I went to like a historic site. Sometimes if you could go to a World War I site, and there will be museum quality places there and docents that can give you leads on other better sources.
That's actually a great segue to the next question. Can you talk about the importance of physically going to a place where the story is set and what you look for when you're there?
I think it's helpful to go, even though it might have changed drastically. I don't know, maybe this is too woo-woo, but I think something about your feet being planted on that place.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just the weather. There's something, or maybe you just notice something that you never would have through books you would have never experienced. But I know with Clark and Division going to Chicago, to go to that intersection of Clark and Division, what was really helpful was I actually had a guide who took me through those places. So I think not only going there, but there's so many of these walking tours of different places, and docents and things. If you could contact them before you go and make those arrangements, I think that it'll just breathe some new life into what you're working on.
When I was writing this most recent book, I did take a number of historical tours, walking tours in San Francisco. That's where I got everybody's residential address. I took all these photographs and this is where they would live. This is how long it's going to take, all that kind of stuff. But maybe the more meaningful thing was I got a tour from this guy who, Reed Coleman, I think his name is. He does these little Mini Cooper tours. It's convertible. You're in the back seat. He's got all the headset on. You can hear him. You tell him what you're writing your book about, and he makes out a map. And he drove me to all the places where the riot had taken place and the hospital and all this kind of stuff. And on top of that, he pulled into UN Plaza in San Francisco, and not something I was thinking about at all. And he's like, yeah, I just read this great article about how much San Francisco thought they were going to get the UN headquarters and how that was happening right about at the time that you're describing. And that became a major point in my book because I was there riding along and passed UN Plaza and stopped. And then afterward, I got out and went into the library and found all this stuff. So being there jogged something.
I totally agree, and I agree with the woo-woo, Naomi. When I wrote about Birmingham a lot, I've been to Birmingham a lot, but I went back while I was writing Times Undoing because my protagonist is a journalist, so I wanted to place her on a corner there. And she even has a line in the book that says the earth holds all the dirt. So I think being someplace with your feet planted in that space really invokes body memory and all kinds of things. I know people who write about World War II across the ocean side, and they talk about standing where in Normandy, standing in the cemeteries helps them really to get a feel for
Yeah, and
the
I don't know if the World War I writer can afford a
no,
trip to
yeah,
Europe,
yeah,
but that might, I'm sure there's very special tours. If you
yeah,
can't afford it, maybe I'm sure YouTube, there's people who have gone to these historic sites and
yeah.
you could get a visual, moving taste of it. Yeah.
How do you acknowledge the parts of your book that are not historically accurate? You put it someplace that like in the preface or acknowledgments?
Just put in the author's note in the back.
The author's note's so important. I don't know
Mhm.
how you handle, like, do you guys keep any running notes while you're writing of things you want to confess or call their attention to?
No, I don't usually do that. I've had arguments with readers about they go like, I know this is historical fiction, but that didn't happen that way. And I said, yeah, but that person didn't even exist that I have in this space. So it's a balancing act. I think for the big things, the author's notes are great.
I do keep a running tally of all the people who helped me, in a historical context, as well as all the articles.
Yeah.
This next book, Crown City, it's crazy that I have a really thick bibliography, and I
Bibliography.
think it's important right now in this day of AI, in this fabrication, or what are they, the hallucination, to really center my work.
Right.
I mean, yeah, it's fiction, but I, did my due diligence on
Right. Or
research.
attribution is
Yeah.
always important.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I tend to, because of the kind of fiction I write, I tend to tell in the author's note, these are the real life characters, and this is how closely the novel sticks to what actually happened. These are the characters who are fictional, though inspired by real life characters. Here are the real life characters who inspired me to write this fictional person. And of course, like this, so Sandy Zimmer does not exist, but
Right.
she's inspired by these women publishers.
Right.
I just think it's interesting to hear who the
Mm-hmm.
inspirations for that are.
I did a list for the Pasadena book of all. I unfortunately have a lot of characters, and I starred the people, the real life characters, or
Mm-hmm.
inspired by real life, and then I get into it more in the author's note. Yeah.
The Penguin Random lawyers made me make a list of the people who are real and the people who are not real in Times I'm doing. So,
Oh gosh, yeah.
Okay, is there too much? Can you do too much research and then don't know where to put all the stuff and it takes away from your story? Have you run into that situation?
I haven't run into it, but I could see how it could happen. And I've heard a lot of people who, they're just, um, I think it's because of my newspaper training. I know there's a point where there's a deadline, So even if it's a self-made deadline, so that kind of helps me to be on track. But, you just park it. If there's something that just personally interests you, that research isn't going to go away.
right.
You just park it and go to the next thing.
I also feel like I don't think you can ever do too much research unless doing the research prevents you from writing the book.
I
which
think
it
that's the
can.
problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I tend to take those little nuggets and put them, we park it. But if there's one fact or one person or one event that keeps nagging at you, you need to go back and see why.
Yeah.
Well, I think you've covered this a little bit already, but how do you get dialogue right? Relying on history, letters? It seems like a big challenge in the writing of historical.
Mm-hmm. I mean, letters are so, epistolary research, you're using phrases that people use, greetings that they use. I think letters are really helpful for that. If you can't do oral histories, yeah, that's really helpful for dialogue, I think. When I write Westerns, uh, my partner is always saying, you're not writing," because I have Gunsmoke on in the background. But I had guns, so I'm describing a buckboard, and I'm going like, I'm so tired of using buckboard or wagon. And then I'm listening to Gunsmoke, and they say, yeah, better get that better get that rig over there. I'm going like, wig, that's it. I go back and change
Yeah.
the word. So all that's helpful.
I love looking at the origin of words because I'm going, could they have really said that at that time? And then I look at the history. Oh yeah, it's been
It's
around for
amazing.
100
Yeah,
years.
they used this in 1600. You go like,
Yeah.
wow.
Oh wow, I had no idea.
I
Yeah.
think it's also helpful. I have the same narrator, audiobook narrator for all of the Jane Benjamin novels. So now it's like after she did the first one, I started hearing her voice when I was writing and editing. And
Oh,
so
interesting.
now I think it helps me with dialogue. If I'm self-doubting about my dialogue, then I'll read it aloud, but I'll be hearing her voice. And if it feels dumb or awkward or not natural, that's my key. If I can't read it aloud, then probably there's something problem there. A problem there.
Mhm.
I know
I,
it.
I
Oh,
love this
Jacqueline.
question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, I
Go ahead.
just briefly say like Jacqueline Winspear, her Maisie Dobbs doesn't really speak in dialect, but
Mhm.
what's the young guy? I don't know.
Henry?
Yeah, he's more the salt of the earth, and that's where and so you can maybe have more fun with like a secondary character and have
Mhm.
the main one speak more standard.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, Rick.
Oh no, this I just love this question. How crazy do you get with your research? Tell us anecdotes. For example, did any of you dress up in the clothes of the period to get an idea what it was like? Eat any of the food,
I don't think eating is crazy.
You know?
But because I live on the West Coast, like the Polish population is so big in Chicago, right? I don't know if this is a historical, it's more demographic thing, but yeah, I had to take my mom to the Polish restaurant and eat, what was it, pickle soup or something like that.
Mm.
My people, thank you.
I went to, I do a lot in San Francisco. It's really close to Sacramento. So I go there a lot to, research things. So we went there to John's Grill for dinner one night, and we sat at John's Grill is like that famous Maltese Falcon bar, Um, so we sat at the bar, kind of crowded. We had my Manhattan, his martini, and we had such a great night at that bar that, let me tell you, that's the last scene in my current book. Not the two of us at that bar, but that bar, because it was there then, that's, its highest moment was being there, just the going there, the walking those streets, those sitting on those bar stools, that kind of thing. It gets in there, whether or not it gets in there explicitly. So I don't know if it's crazy or not, but to me, it feels real natural and a really fun part of writing
Yeah.
historical fiction.
I did once lie on the floor of my office with my hands loosely tied behind my back with my ankles to see how I needed to wriggle to get out of it. That was for one of my Charlie books. And I hoped my neighbors weren't looking.
Tried to climb a tree for that very reason. It was not pretty, so I looked it up on YouTube.
Since I'm in LA, there's a lot. I needed to know the ancient way of like planing wood. And fortunately there was a demonstration at Huntington Library, and just the smell, and the just
Mhm.
physically doing that. I mean, that was so helpful. So
Mhm. Mhm. I tell you, a good place for dialogue is the train station. You know, we're writers, so we can eavesdrop because that's research. And if you sit there long enough, you hear the most fabulous combination of words.
Okay, how does one avoid info dumps in historical crime fiction? And do you think that all those unnecessary pages of the story in the early drafts are for you to understand the story better?
Hmm. I'm one of these people that I write short. And my editor says, Naomi, more, get into the details. I go,
Yeah,
So I don't really have that problem. But I think actually it's helpful to write more because
yeah,
it's easier to cut than
it
to
is.
manufacture. So if you do write a lot, just be prepared, like what Shelley had to do, take a big chunk of that train ride out. But I don't think there's a problem with writing more in your first draft, especially.
Um, do you plot your book before you do the research?
Oh, good point. Uh,
Hmm.
yes and no. I've done it both ways. Um, I mean, I am a plotter, so I usually have an outline if I can help it. If but I've become a hybrid. Times I'm doing really help me become more hybrid with that. So sometimes, like for those historical pieces, the scenes I wanted, those chapters I wanted to write organically, and a couple times I wrote out a sequence, so that was a different kind of experience for me. But I like the control of having an outline, even whether I use it or not.
Me too. I do research first because I want to make sure that my historical premise is interesting enough to me. Does
Mm,
it feel sticky to me? Like this is a spot that needs some attention. So I do enough research so I know what the sticky spots are for me. And then I definitely plot and I continue researching while I'm writing. And
yeah.
I'm willing to change my plot when I discover something fantastic. Um, but I don't think I get too overwhelmed with the idea of writing a whole book if I don't have some kind of plan. I don't mind changing the plan as I go, but I like to have a plan.
I think the most important thing is to get the voice of your characters.
Mm.
I think people worry too. I mean, I do a rough kind of outline myself, but I think the biggest challenge is what's the tone of the book and and your voice of your characters. And but like for this one I'm working on 1959 to do the proposal, I did have to come up with a synopsis. And it is helpful because I figured out half of this book would be a courtroom drama,
Mm.
and if I didn't have that in the back of my mind, I'd be going all over the place, and now I know half of it will be courtroom, so I'm going to have to set it up accordingly. So that's going to save me a lot of time.
No, this is kind of on the same note we talked about doing too much research and the cost for time and aggravation to seed out the interesting bits from the drafts that don't forward the story. You have a process for doing that, or do you rely on editors to tell you that that's too much?
I have a way of thinking about chapters or scenes that I like certain things to happen in a scene. I like there to be some kind of change, and it can be a very minor change, but something has to have changed and there has to be some kind of conflict. So I have a list of things I want to happen in a scene. And then if I look at that scene and find that the details are getting in the way of those things I expect of a scene, then I think maybe these details go somewhere else, or maybe just fewer of them. So I really, after I put everything in, then I go, I really want them to feel like things are changing. And if my details are stopping that change, time to carve out some of my details.
And those details have to be meaningful to advance the plot or else establish the character. They're not there to entertain you. So even though they might be the coolest details to you,
Mm-hmm.
your character may not care about it. So I think that's a good way to kind of weigh it down. But I'm not really into description. I'm kind of odd for a historical fiction writer. Well, I guess that's my second, my new identity, because I don't tend to write that much about, I will not be the one to go into the whole costume. I'm not, for one thing, I'm not good at writing that, you know, and I think if you're very good at writing description, that's your asset and that could be your downfall because you're just describing, you just do a beautiful job in describing, but you know, but your reader might not be that so, you know, wired in that way.
Mhm. I feel like I'm kind of old school around the detail. Like for instance, around thrillers. I don't write thrillers per se, but one of the Charlie books is I consider a thriller. And I noticed the new thrillers are much more focused on pace of action, and that pace of action has gotten faster. And I think that's because audiences, that's what they can bear now. I mean, yeah, especially young audiences, it's like this. And I kind of like that slower pace of more details because I'm in a logic puzzle usually when I'm doing a mystery, and I want each each detail to really build on the logic of the conclusion. So I think I get in trouble with that with that sometimes,
Thank you.
especially around the thriller stuff.
I love as a reader when you get to the end and then you go, oh my gosh, I should have seen that coming.
That's right.
They
But
drop
you have to have it there. Even if they forget, if they go back, it's there. Go like, oh damn, that was there.
back and reread it because I know, I like subconsciously, I know the trail was laid. They took the time to lay the trail and I was not paying attention well enough. So I
Mhm.
love that you do that.
One thing we didn't talk about, which I think is really important, is point of view, like first person versus
Mhm.
third.
Mhm.
And I kind of decided, I will say this, I have noticed like younger people like have read like Clark and Division, and they seem to like the first, I think there's, you know, we shouldn't write the trends, but there is a trend in like more books for younger people that they tend to be
Mhm.
in first person.
Yes.
And I think younger people do resonate, they connect with that more.
Yeah, I had thought of that.
So, but then I decided that although I do first, nobody really knows that, although a reader just wrote me about it, that she noticed my protagonist would be slightly older
Mm.
when she's telling her story.
Ah, uh-huh.
And that's one reason, like, I can use certain language in the dialogue, but when she refers to like black folks, she says blacks in the,
Mhm.
you know, in her narrative because she's a slightly older person. If
Right.
she was, you know, back then she would use
In the
other
moment.
language. So
Right, right.
perhaps, you know, so
Mhm.
that's kind of how I solved the issue,
These
you know.
POV decisions get to be super difficult. And unfortunately, I wound up like in quicksand in my first novel, trying to decide it. Like I wrote it all one way, then change it all to the other way, and wound up with I had a third person voice, but very close to the protagonist.
Mhm.
At a certain point in the book, it turns into first person when it is revealed that the protagonist is the one writing this story from a great distance. So she's an elderly woman writing about her 17-year-old self. And I
Mhm.
really love the idea of it, but it came to me how it was maybe unnecessarily complicated for a beginning novelist like me. When
Mm.
my audiobook narrator, we had a Zoom, she lives in Spain, we had a Zoom, and she said, I need to talk to you about, so Jane is very old when she's writing this, writing about herself. Does she know? So she knows what her mother did. So when she's describing this, how, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was complicated, and I really love the way it worked out. But also, I think my POV experiment was maybe a bit beyond what I could have and should have been doing right then.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I think about multiple voices. I
Mhm.
still haven't been able, well, I'll be, yeah, tackling it with this book, but it's
Uh,
taking me a while. And I decided to do this new book since they're both male characters. I'm doing it third.
Oh,
It's just too hard for me to do first.
yeah.
And yeah.
I wrote my first book, the self-published one at first, and I vowed never to do that again because I'm much too interested in a little bit of teaching about the times, and so I can't always do that in first. So I tend to be more like close third now.
Let me combine some of these questions because I think we've got a lot of them. I hope we can get through them all. But first of all, do you use sensitivity readers? And second, do you use trigger warnings?
No to trigger warnings, yes to sensitivity readers. Especially when I'm writing about a culture, a community, of people I don't know.
No one know except for I'm of a woman of a certain generation, and we didn't really have sensitivity readers.
Yeah, no.
I have readers. I've
Tough
always
enough.
had readers check over my work for different reasons. And, so I will have people, if I'm writing about a different part of the world, I will have a person check over like the dialogue and all that kind of stuff. So yes, I do that, but I don't necessarily call them sensitivity readers. They're just among my readers, my beta readers or checkers or experts.
Um, I don't have trigger warnings, and I haven't had sensitivity readers. In my first novel, I created a protagonist who cross-dressed in 1937 to get a job during the Great Depression in San Francisco. And when she cross-dresses, cuts off her hair, wears a man's clothes, gets a job as a copy boy, when she does that, her life changes because she can move differently. She thinks differently. She's far more assertive than she used to be. It's life changing for her. And so in my mind, she was doing this for economic reasons, as so many women have done during hard economic times.
Mhm.
And she discovered it's easier to be a man. But then I started meeting people who were saying, readers are like, so she's trans, right? I'm like, well, I didn't plan on her to be trans.
And they didn't call it that then.
But also, what does it mean? You know what I mean? I feel like my
Mhm.
character started to grow and be someone that I didn't 100% plan on. It was just kind of happening.
Mm.
So then in my second book, I asked my editor, do I need to have a sensitivity read here? Because, do I need to make sure I'm not doing this in a clod-footed way? And then she read through it. She goes, you absolutely are not. You've got her as being somewhat of a doofus. That's what she said. Like, she's not self-reflective. She's not looking at herself very much to figure out what's going on. But I've always wondered if it would have been better had I gotten a sensitivity reader, even though I myself, dang, I don't know where she lies in this this off discussed continuum.
Right.
Well, I might say something controversial, but I think it's really hard with sensitivity reads because are you asking one person to represent everyone in that group to tell, you might come up with very different responses from people. And I'm sure sensitivity readers are trained to kind of look, but I don't really get how it works to tell
Mhm.
you
Well, when I've used
honestly.
them, I've used more than one person, and I really am asking kind of broad questions. Am I making assumptions that are not clear or offensive? And if so, what can I do to change it? In one case, someone said, you should add another character who's trans in this book. I went, oh, I can do that. Because I fell into a trope. I fell into a
Mhm.
situation it triggers young people if trans people die. And in the book I wrote, this trans
Mm.
woman died, and the trans person I asked said, I think you're being true to her character, her nature, her story arc. Why don't you add another trans person who doesn't die? I'm going like, I can do that. You know?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
This one was targeted for Naomi. It says at the beginning you mentioned it's important to use real names. Is that to create a historical record, or does that add to the story you're putting out there?
Okay, I meant that for my nonfiction.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, this I thought it was interesting. Have you ever used newspaper clippings, images, or references from the period of your novels to express a controversial subject without the character having to say it? It's like in the newspaper article, you know,
Sure,
that's the context of the controversy.
sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, I have.
Okay, good. I like that. Yeah.
I think that's, or it's, well, I've made up a newspaper
Yeah. Yeah.
article.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see.
Let's see. How do you and your publishers handle potential slander or inaccuracies with real people in your fiction? If it happened.
Mhm.
Well, it'd be libel, not slander. And I mean, the test for libel is if it's true,
Mhm.
so, and the characters well, the case where it comes out the most is this one that I've written from 1903. So all those people have passed away, and many of them, for whatever reason, did not have children. So, yeah, but they also haven't, the ones that do have children, I don't have them doing anything dastardly. They're just a part of the whole milieu of the arts and crafts movement in Pasadena. I have Mr. Vroman's, the founder of Vroman's bookstore in Pasadena.
Oh, interesting.
He goes in and out, and yeah. But it was just based on his accounts of him, and photographs. So I don't think anyone's going to sue me for having him walk around with a horse in the Arroyo.
I started out thinking that I would literally have Dorothea Lange as a character in my first novel.
Mhm.
And I've always idolized her work. I love it so much. And then did so much research into her. And of course, discovered that she was a human being. And among the things I discovered was that in order for her to do this brilliant, needed, useful, fantastic work, she and her husband would leave and travel for months at a time to be along the highways and the irrigation ditches doing this great work together. And so they would put their children in foster homes,
Wow.
so 5 children in foster homes. And it
Wow.
got me because, I mean, wow, part of my theme throughout all my work is ambitious women in history, and was it worth it? What do they have to do to achieve these things? What do they have to willingly put aside? And at that point, even though the whole thing fascinated me, I could not use her name anymore. She became a
Mhm.
fictionalized character,
Mm.
100% inspired by Dorothea
Yes.
Lange,
Mhm.
made more dastardly because she was fictional, and largely because she has children and grandchildren. And you know what I mean? I didn't want to say stuff with their family names on it.
Mm.
Mhm. Well, the lawyers at Penguin Random House did ask me to take out the name of a sheriff who was actually part of the story, and I have the source material to show it and lots of proof. But they still asked me to take the name of the sheriff out who is dead and gone, but maybe they feared that he had, relatives who might be upset. So I took it out. It was no big deal, especially since I put the actual newspaper article in the book and it says his name. So, yeah, duh.
They put you through the ringer, Cheryl.
Yeah, they did.
I've never been, yeah, I never had to go through any of that.
In your approaches to historical fiction, do you consider your stories theme-based or character-driven?
Uh, yeah, I think for Times Undoing, it was why it was important for me to do alternating chapters and doing this dual timeline, because the historical timeline was definitely character driven, and the contemporary timeline, even though I had a strong, interesting young protagonist, I was really focused on the themes, her work as a journalist, and the themes of identifying the hidden stories of Black people during Jim Crow.
Think I've got kind of both going on. Like I almost always, when I know this sort of historical premise or place where things are sticky for me, I usually have a couple or three questions I have. Like an example of that would be, when is it right to tell the truth in the newspaper? And when is it right to conceal information or not share it, like related to war, planning, that kind of thing. And so that's in a way a theme. When is the truth best? When is discretion better? And then what I like to do is to make sure that people don't all agree, that I have characters who approach that central question from a different place on the, sort of the circle of personalities. So they would all answer that question a little differently. And they don't have to have some big debate at dinner where they're all debating the question. I just like to have different points of view represented, related to that theme. And that's just, I just enjoy that. I like the relationship between theme and people. And so for me, it's kind of both.
Yeah, I'm with you, Shelley. That's how I, at least with this historical series that I'm working on, it's the same way. But I would throw in, for me, it's geography too. And that's why it's called the Japantown, mystery series. Yeah. So, and I figured out a lot of times the geography is kind of my antagonist. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think this is the last question, unless I missed some. And if I did, I apologize. But this has just been a fascinating discussion. So, but the question is, I'm going to put this in, I'm going to reword it. But do you ever walk away from your story for a while, take a break from it, pick it up later? And how long do you do that? If you do it.
I've just discovered that that's a really good thing for me to do. I hadn't done that much before, but I've found that especially I've been working on short stories, and most of them historical. It's so much better when I walk away from them and come back to them. I just see them in a new light. I always do a big reorg of the story, and it makes the story better. I don't know why. The distance helps me.
Sometimes when you don't walk away, it's almost like you've got this problem and you're pushing really hard down on it and you're not solving it. And you just kind of need to put the tools down, walk away, and you're like, oh, I see what the problem was. While I'm pushing really hard, urgently, I almost never figure that out.
Yeah, I do it all the time. And I think Clark and Division started off with another novel, that was actually set in LA, and we didn't get many bites, and I just needed to rest. And then there's a time for something to be born,
That's
book.
true. That is so true.
And I have ideas for other books that I know I probably am not going to be working on for another 5, 6, 7 years, And even with this Pasadena book, I've been thinking about it for like 7 years. But it just, I didn't have enough tools. I didn't have the time. I didn't have the, ambition. And it just, there comes a time there comes a time where it's like, okay, now I'm ready. I have enough information. There's things going on in this world that make it possible for me to work on this book.
Yeah.
Fermentation takes time.
Marination. You have to marinate.
And marination, yeah. Well, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you all very much. And I think that's all our questions. And it's been wonderful.
Thank you, Rick, for helping us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And thank you to our audience. You guys were amazing. We had a lot of people on, so we really do appreciate you showing up. I think we just wanted to remind people that are local in Sacramento that one of our members, Jim Latoile, is having a book launch today at Face in a Book. It's actually in 10 minutes.
He's a great guy.
Yeah,
he's a great guy and a great writer.
Yes, yes. And he publishes like twice a year, so.
Yeah, how's he do it?
Yeah, so if you have time and you want to stop by, again, it starts at 3 o'clock at Face in a Book.
Nice.
And definitely check out all of our other authors' books. And Shelley's about to start her whole book launch.
Yeah. Good luck, Shelley.
Yeah,
Good
Shelley.
luck.
Yes.
If you come to LA, let me know.
Right after this, I'm going downstairs and watching something to wear.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. You're a great
Thank you,
interview.
Oh, thank you.
everybody.
Yes, love
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good to see
Bye.
you
Bye,
guys.
Al. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.